So what was manumission? Manumission was the legal act of freeing a slave. Think of it as Rome's version of, congratulations, you're slightly more human now. It came in several flavors. You could be freed in a will. You could be freed for loyal service. You could even buy your own freedom with saved-up peculium, which we've previously established was like trying to buy a house using tip money from a lemonade stand. Some masters freed slaves as a grand gesture of generosity. Others did it as a power move, so they could boast about how benevolent they were, like a Roman version of a billionaire giving their butler a Rolex and then blogging about it. There were even ceremonial ways to do it. You could be manumitted in front of a magistrate. You could be tapped on the shoulder with a ceremonial rod called the vindicta. Yes, even their legal items sound like minor Marvel villains. And voila, your slavehood was legally over. Except, well, not really. The Freedman Clause, independence with footnotes. Once freed, you became a libertus if you were male, or a liberta if you were female. Congratulations, you were now officially formerly owned. Rome even had a bureaucratic box for that. Freedmen were granted limited citizenship. You could marry. You could own property. You could even amass ridiculous amounts of wealth if you played your cards right. But, and this is important, you were still tied to your former master, now called your patronus. And no, you couldn't just ignore them. You owed them loyalty, public praise, and sometimes labor. If they got into legal trouble, you were expected to defend them. If they wanted help campaigning for office, they were your free but legally obligated hype man. Think of it as freedom, but please clap. Freedmen careers, from cell to suitcase. Once manumitted, many freedmen did what all former slaves with economic ambition did. They opened shops, ran small businesses, or managed the domus household of their old masters as professional managers. Some became tax collectors. Others opened taverns or managed apartment blocks. In Pompeii alone, the graffiti shows that many bakers, butchers, and traders were liberti. One even owned a bar called the House of the Gladiator's Friend, which sounds like a great place to get stabbed in a meat pie. The wealthier freedmen often funded public works to gain clout. Fountains, statues, shrines, little marble PR campaigns to say, I may have been property, but now I am the property. But not everyone liked this. Elite Romans, gatekeeping since 509 BCE. Patricians, the old Roman upper crust, hated successful freedmen. They saw them as tacky social climbers who threw loud banquets, wore too many rings, and insisted on being respected. Ooh, how dare they? Writers like Horace and Juvenal mocked them relentlessly. They were painted as parvenus, people who got rich too fast and forgot their place. You'll see the phrase freedman arrogance tossed around Roman literature like it's a diagnosis. But here's the thing. Liberti weren't allowed to hold public office. They couldn't serve in the Senate or become high-ranking magistrates. And their children? They could. Which terrified the elites even more, because suddenly the son of a former slave could become your political rival, or worse, your son-in-law. From slave to celebrity and back again. Some freedmen became so influential, they practically ran the empire behind the scenes. Take Tiberius Claudius Narcissus, a freedman who served under Emperor Claudius. He handled official correspondence, managed the emperor's schedule, and was basically the first-century Roman version of a chief of staff, if the chief of staff once scrubbed your bathwater. Another, Pallas, became so wealthy under Claudius that later writers accused him of embezzling half the empire, though, to be fair, that's what everyone said about everyone in Roman politics. But their power didn't last. When new emperors came into power, these former slaves were often purged. Turns out, being the brains behind the throne only works until the guy in the throne feels threatened. And that, dear listener, is how you can go from foot washer to VIP to suspicious corpse in the space of 3 emperors. Freed women. Free, but don't get ideas. Let's pause and talk about freed women who, shockingly, had an even harder time than their male counterparts. While they too could own property and marry, Roman society still expected them to be quiet, obedient, and preferably invisible. Some worked as midwives or market sellers. A few became poets, philosophers, or priestesses. But the stigma clung tightly. Freed women who had once been sex slaves or concubines often couldn't escape the social whispers. Even their tombstones reveal the bias. Men were praised for earning freedom. Women were praised for being chaste and silent. Because apparently, freedom was fine as long as it wasn't loud. Slavery as identity. The branding problem. Here's the weirdest part. Even after manumission, your name reminded everyone of your past. Freedmen didn't get to pick a cool new name like Maximus or Vibius Dangerous. Instead, they were required to take on the praenomen and nomen of their former master, with their original slave name tacked on as a cognomen. So if your master was Gaius Julius and your slave name was Felix, your new name became Gaius Julius Felix. It's like being legally renamed Steve's Jeff's former property. Even in freedom, you were a walking advertisement for someone else's power. Rome's weird halfway house of liberty. Despite all this, manumission was still seen as a good thing, a mark of achievement, something to aspire to. Because in a world where being legally owned was normal, being formerly owned was progress. And Roman society depended on that weird in-between. Slaves dreamed of being freed, freedmen tried to climb the social ladder, and everyone quietly ignored the part where none of this would exist if Rome hadn't enslaved people in the first place. It was a pyramid built on paradoxes. At the bottom, hopelessness. In the middle, hope. At the top, senators saying, "Let's keep things just the way they are."
So, you've survived breakfast, a single root, 3 hot rocks, a questionable egg, and an adrenaline spike. Congratulations. Now it's time to think about dinner. Because in the ancient world, food isn't a mealtime. It's a full-time job. And every hour you spend not gathering, hunting, drying, or preserving food is an hour closer to starvation. You don't eat because it's 6 p.m. You eat because your hands still work, because your legs still move, because you haven't been mauled by a boar or bitten by a snake. Yet. So let's talk strategy. Your ancestors didn't have pressure cookers or seasoning racks. They had rocks, fire, and determination forged from sheer existential desperation. And with those tools, they invented everything. Let's start with meat. You didn't just stroll into a butcher shop and pick out a nice cut of lamb. You chased that lamb over rocks, through thorn bushes, across miles of brutal terrain on bare feet, hoping to wear it down before it wore you down. It's called persistence hunting. Imagine running in 100-degree heat for 6 hours. Your prey bolts, you follow. It hides, you track. It runs again. You jog slowly, methodically, until eventually its heart gives out before yours does. That's dinner. If you're lucky, someone brought a spear, or a hand axe, or a sharpened bone tied to a stick with sinew and hope. You drag the carcass back to camp, covered in sweat, blood, and glory. Your reward? The overwhelming joy of figuring out how to cook 100 pounds of raw animal with nothing but fire and stones. Welcome to Paleolithic barbecue. Spoiler, there's no grill. There's no stainless steel tongs, no aluminum foil. No, let me just throw this on the smoker for 8 hours. Just flame, flesh, and time. First, the skin comes off. With flint tools so dull they make butter knives look dangerous. You scrape, tug, and flay until the hide peels back. The smell? A mix of blood, burnt hair, and primal satisfaction. Then the butchering begins. There's no refrigeration. You don't get to save some for later. So you eat fast. You share. You dry what you can. Smoke what you can't. And hope the wolves don't come sniffing around tonight. If you have a fire and some patience, you roast the meat on a stick. Slow. Rotating. Not because it makes the meat tender, but because if you stop spinning it, one side turns to charcoal. And that char? That's the ancient seasoning. A little crunch, a little ash, and a little reminder that flavor wasn't invented, it was endured. Sometimes you didn't even roast the meat. You buried it. Hot stones in a pit. Meat wrapped in leaves, covered with soil. You wait hours, maybe a full day. It's the original slow cooker. Only instead of beeping when it's done, you just dig until it smells right. Or until the buzzards start circling. But meat isn't everything, especially when meat tries to kill you back. Most of the time, your ancient diet was plants, roots, grasses, seeds, bark. And just like meat, these weren't gifts, they were puzzles. Ever try eating a raw acorn? Don't. It's bitter enough to make your tongue cry. But your ancestors figured it out. They soaked them, crushed them, rinsed them in rivers for days to leach out the tannins. Then they dried them, ground them, and made a kind of flour. Acorn pancakes, baby! With a side of dirt. And maybe a crunchy bug for texture. No whisk, no mixing bowl. Just a rock and another rock. Banging until something edible happens. That's the universal prehistoric recipe. Step 1, find thing. Step 2, bash thing. Step 3, burn thing. Step 4, eat thing anyway. Now let's talk grains, because agriculture hasn't been invented yet. So when you want to eat wheat, you don't, because wheat doesn't exist. What you do have is wild grass seeds. Tiny, hard, lodged in husks that laugh at your molars. You harvest them by hand. You grind them on a stone slab called a quern, basically a prehistoric blender powered by rage and arm strength. Then you mix the flour with water. No yeast, no sugar, just mud-flavored dough that you slap onto a hot rock. It cooks fast. It burns faster. And now you have bread. Sort of. If drywall and cardboard had a baby, that would be your breakfast. Still, it's food. And that's the only category that matters. Now imagine you want soup. You don't have a pot. You don't have a bowl. You don't even have the word soup yet. But what you do have is a stomach. Not yours. An animal's. You clean it, tie off the ends, fill it with water, herbs, bits of meat, and hang it over the fire. Congratulations, you've invented the world's first soup pouch. It jiggles when it boils. It smells like a wet shoe, but it's warm and vaguely edible. You sip from a hollow bone, slurp down meat stew like it's a sacred ritual. Because it is. Cooking isn't a chore. It's survival art. And it's dangerous. If you burn the meat, you starve. If you eat the wrong plant, you die. If your fire goes out and you can't relight it, you freeze. And if you try to steal someone else's food, well, let's just say that history doesn't remember the guy who stole mammoth jerky and lived to brag about it. The truth is, ancient cooking wasn't rustic. It wasn't charming. It was brutal. It was raw. It was a dance between life and death played out over smoke and stone. And still, somehow, it worked. Your ancestors didn't just survive. They figured it out. how to boil without pots, how to bake without ovens, how to cook meals without a single modern tool. Also, you could one day ask your microwave to reheat your leftovers for 30 seconds and complain that it's still cold in the middle.
You've chewed bark. You've roasted rat. You've turned hot rocks into a stove, a grill, and a funeral pyre for your eyebrows. And now you're officially a prehistoric chef. But the real challenge isn't just cooking. It's keeping the food you've cooked. Because in the ancient world, spoilage isn't a nuisance. It's a predator. Silent, invisible, relentless. There is no refrigeration, no freezer, no best buy date. The best you get is eat it before it walks off again. So how did ancient people preserve food? With what they had. Smoke, salt, air, fire, time, and a deep existential fear of starvation. Let's start with smoking. You've got meat. You want it to last. But you can't just hang it in the breeze and hope for the best. That's how maggots happen. So you build a smokehouse. Except house is generous. It's really a pile of green wood smoldering beneath a tripod of sticks. You hang strips of meat, thin, bloody, full of hope, above the smoke. You don't cook them. You bathe them in smoke for hours, days, sometimes weeks. The smoke drives off flies. The heat dries the flesh. And the result is jerky, tough, chewy, salty, the original protein bar. And yes, you'll eat it even if it tastes like leather that's been stepped on by a mammoth. Next up is salting. Salt is gold, literal survival currency. If you have salt, you have power. If you don't, you have bacteria. So when you get your hands on it, scraped from rocks, evaporated from sea spray, you guard it like treasure. You rub it into meat, fish, even vegetables if you're fancy. It pulls out moisture, kills microbes, and makes your food last longer. Problem is, it also makes it taste like sadness. But again, ancient culinary standards were low. No one's writing Yelp reviews in 8000 BCE. Then there's drying, the oldest trick in the prehistoric cookbook. And by cookbook, we mean oral tradition barely remembered by someone with a head wound. You slice, you spread, you wait. Fruits, roots, herbs, and fish laid out on flat rocks under the sun, covered in grass to keep the bugs off. If it dries, you store it. If it rots, you bury it and pretend it never happened. Some cultures even dried milk. Yes, milk. Turns out, if you leave it long enough, milk becomes cheese. And if you're really patient and slightly reckless, cheese becomes hard enough to qualify as a weapon. And then there's the burial method. You dig a pit, line it with leaves, drop in the meat, wrap it in bark, and cover it with earth. Days pass, the temperature stays low, the meat ferments. Maybe it gets tender. Maybe it becomes a biohazard. Either way, it's food. Kind of. Now let's talk containers. Because the Tupperware aisle has not yet been invented. No Ziploc bags. No glass jars with cute labels. You've got two options, natural and disgusting. Natural, gourds, shells, bark, animal stomachs, hollowed out bones. Whatever you can hollow out, dry, and not cry over when it leaks. Disgusting? The same things, but older. Leather pouches that once carried water and now carry everything else. Water skins cured in smoke. clay pots if you're advanced, hardened in fire and sealed with pine resin. And then there's fermentation. Ah, yes, rot, but on purpose. Your ancestors realized that if you leave certain foods out long enough, they start to change. Not always for the better, but sometimes just enough to be edible again, like turning spoiled cabbage into something vaguely tangy and not immediately fatal, or letting fruit juice bubble up until it becomes ancient wine, aka the world's oldest bad decision. Fermentation was magic. It made things last, gave them flavor, and occasionally got everyone drunk enough to forget the mammoth stew didn't turn out great. And the smell? Oh, the smell. Every ancient kitchen was a symphony of sour milk, smoke, mold, and something that might have once been a fish. It wasn't appetizing, but it was effective. Now imagine trying to cook during winter. Fire barely works, wood is wet, food is frozen. You scrape the last tubers out of the frozen dirt with numb fingers. You gnaw on dried meat that feels like chewing on a sandal. You boil snow in a cracked pot over a flickering fire, hoping it doesn't collapse inward from the cold. There is no grocery run. There is only rationing and regret. The food you preserve during the warm months, it's everything now. That moldy root, dinner. That dried fish spine, soup. That weird sticky bundle of leaves you stored in a tree trunk and forgot about, dessert, probably. This is where culinary invention thrives. Not in kitchens with granite counters, but in caves with ice on the walls, and nothing but creativity and survival instinct. And even in the bitter cold, people gathered around fire, shared meals, told stories, laughed with teeth missing, cracked jokes with chapped lips, and made ancient food taste like home. Because here's the thing about cooking without modern tools. You're not just feeding yourself. You're communing with the land, with the past, with the very idea of survival. And when you finally crawl into your pile of hides, stomach full of fermented mystery stew and smoked squirrel jerky, you whisper a prayer to whatever stars haven't frozen over yet. Thank you for the fire. Thank you for the roots. Thank you for that one day the rabbit tripped on a log and basically cooked itself. Thank you for making it another day. Because in the ancient world, food wasn't just nourishment. It was salvation. In every crackling ember and every gnawed bone.
So far, you've smoked your dinner, buried your leftovers, and accidentally created something that might qualify as the first experimental charcuterie. But now it's time to leave the cave. Because ancient cooking wasn't just about individual survival. It was about something deeper, something louder, something smoky, chaotic, and weirdly social. It was about the feast. Yes, before modern ovens, before table manners, before anyone decided that forks needed 4 tines and not 3, there were feasts. Epic, messy, ritual-filled banquets that didn't just feed bodies, they fed tribes, spirits, gods. You didn't throw a feast because you were hungry, you threw one because something mattered. A birth, a death, a hunt gone right, a harvest that didn't kill everyone. The ancient feast was your social media, your church, your TED Talk, and your therapy session, all lit by firelight and served on leaves. Let's set the scene. You live in a tribe of maybe 30 people. You don't have a last name, but you do have a role: gatherer, hunter, firekeeper, or storyteller. Word spreads fast because gossip travels at the speed of survival that a mammoth is fallen. Not by your hand, but into a ravine. Still counts. Suddenly, tonight is feast night. You drag meat into camp, smoke it over a massive communal fire. Not for flavor. Flavor is a myth. but because everyone's going to eat it whether it tastes good or not. Kids are laughing, dogs are circling, old people are sharpening sticks, not because they need them, but because it makes them feel useful. Someone's pounding tubers into a mushy paste with a rock the size of your head. Someone else is drying berries into sticky clusters that will rip out your teeth, but at least it's sweet. There's no music, but someone's drumming on a log. Someone else is howling in rhythm, and now it's a concert. The food goes on the fire, not over it, on it, right in the coals, wrapped in leaves, stuffed into clay, skewered on sticks. A dozen little prehistoric culinary disasters happening at once. Smells of charred bone, sizzling fat, and celebratory armpit fill the air. It's chaos, it's communion, it's dinner. And somehow, against all odds, it works. Because cooking back then wasn't about measuring teaspoons. It was about sharing labor, sharing risk, sharing food, even if it tasted like smoky moss on a burnt stick. You pass meat down the line, everyone tears off chunks with their teeth. No napkins, no plates, just hands, and maybe a flat rock if you're feeling fancy. And then someone brings out the special dish, the one saved for moments like this. It's fermented, it's buried, it's suspicious. You're not sure what animal it came from. You're not sure if it came from an animal. But the elder says it's sacred, so you eat it, because disrespect gets you exiled. Or worse, shoved into the latrine pit for a week. So you chew, and it tastes like sour smoke and wet bark soaked in regret. But you smile, because it's tradition. And tradition, even back then, was just ritualized suffering dressed up as honor. Now let's zoom out. Because communal eating wasn't just a prehistoric thing. Every ancient civilization, once they figured out fire and agriculture, turned food into a performance. Let's start with ancient Egypt. You're a worker hauling limestone blocks to build a pyramid. Your back is a tapestry of sunburn and scabs. But when mealtime comes, you get bread, beer, and onions. Every single day. Not because it's a delicacy, but because that's what's available. And onions, weirdly, are currency. They believe onions have healing power. You believe onions have flavor, which is basically the same thing. Your bread is hard enough to shatter teeth because it's baked with sand. Yes, sand. Because their grindstones leave grit in the flour. So every meal is a dental procedure. But you chew anyway, because the alternative is starving in the shadow of a monument you're building for someone else's afterlife. Now, hop over to ancient Mesopotamia. They've got beer too, but theirs is thick, cloudy. You drink it with a straw, not for fun, but to avoid the chunks. They love stews, which makes sense because stews are forgiving. You can throw in meat, vegetables, herbs, even regret. Let it simmer for hours, and suddenly it's a meal. They cook in clay pots, over open hearths, in kitchens that double as saunas, fire hazards, and accidental crematoriums. They don't write recipes. They pass them down by memory, prayer, or vague grunts, which explains why half the dishes taste like genius and the other half taste like a dare gone wrong. Then there's ancient China, masters of fermentation. They turn soybeans into sauce, rice into wine, and cabbage into pickled explosions of flavor and gastrointestinal roulette. They steam, they boil, they roast ducks over coals until the skin turns to golden glass. And they do it all without timers, thermometers, or TikTok tutorials. Because back then, cooking wasn't a skill. It was a language. It told you who had power, who got the tender meat, who ate last, who was honored, and who was just lucky to still have a bowl. Ancient Greece. They loved olives, bread, fish. But mostly, they loved talking about food. At symposiums, while reclining, covered in oil, holding figs like microphones. They debated philosophy between bites. Plato, Aristotle, and that one guy who wouldn't stop eating grapes. Their banquets were half meal, half monologue, and if you didn't have something smart to say about virtue or vinegar, you didn't get seconds. Across the sea, the Romans were turning meals into theaters, dishes with dormice stuffed with nuts, eel and honey, peacock tongues. It wasn't about taste, it was about dominance, wealth, showmanship. The more absurd your dinner, the more respected you were, which is why the rich ate things that would make a goat gag. Meanwhile, the poor ate porridge. Always porridge, sometimes with lentils, sometimes with sadness. But whether you were roasting a peacock or boiling barley, the point was the same. Cooking brought people together, not because it was glamorous, but because it had to be. Fire was dangerous, food was scarce, death was close. So they cooked in groups, ate in circles, and passed down knowledge not in books, but in burns, blisters, and shared meals. And as the fire crackled in every corner of the ancient world, one truth held steady. If you could cook, you could connect to others, to ancestors, to something bigger than your next mouthful.
So you feasted beside the fire, watched a duck roast over coals, bitten into bread that doubled as a bludgeoning weapon. You've tasted the ashes of survival and called it a delicacy. But now comes the final trial, the test of true ancient skill, baking. Yes, people were baking long before muffin tins and silicone spatulas. They just didn't know it involved yeast or science or rising time. They just knew flour plus water plus heat equals food, usually. Let's start with the basics. Grain is everything. Grain is life. Grain is why entire civilizations sprouted along rivers, and not just because water is nice for swimming. You harvest it by hand, bent over in the sun, slicing stalks with blades made of flint tied to sticks with animal gut. Then comes threshing, which sounds like a medieval punishment and basically is. You smash the grains to free them from the husks. You toss them in the air so the wind carries away the chaff. You do this for hours, and by the end, you hate wheat so much it feels personal. Next, grinding. You take 2 stones, put the grain between them, and roll, back and forth for hours, until your arms feel like they've been individually cursed by angry gods. The result? Flour. Coarse, gritty, and probably full of rock dust and bug bits. But it's flour. You mix it with water, knead it until your fingers go numb, then flatten it into discs that resemble either bread or punishment, depending on how hot the fire is. No oven? No problem. You heat a rock until it glows. Slap the dough onto it. Hope it doesn't stick. Hope it doesn't burst into flames. Hope it cooks through before the outside becomes charcoal. This is flatbread. The original, the ancient, the indestructible. And honestly, it slaps. Because after a day of chasing deer and soaking acorns and praying the tubers weren't secretly poisonous, even burned bread is a victory. But some people wanted more. They wanted soft. They wanted leavened. They wanted something that didn't sound like wood when you dropped it. And that is where fermentation wanders in like an accidental hero. Because one day, someone left a bit of dough out. Maybe in the sun. Maybe near some old fruit. Maybe in a bowl made of questionable cleanliness. And it rose. Just a little. Just enough to notice. And they cooked it anyway. It was lighter, airier, and didn't break the remaining teeth. Congratulations! That was sourdough. Invented by accident. Perfected by trial. Now sold on Instagram. Ancient Egyptians mastered it. They kept starter cultures alive. Fed them. Talked to them. Passed them down like heirlooms. They baked in cone-shaped clay ovens. Fired from the bottom. Bread slapped to the inner wall like edible wallpaper. It puffed. It browned. It smelled like hope. And it fed millions. This was civilization in loaf form. Even in Rome, bread was political. They had state-run bakeries. Bread was distributed like a public service. Panem et circenses, bread and circuses. Keep the people fed and distracted. Still works, by the way. And if you were wealthy, your bread was white, refined, sieved, pure. If you were poor, it was brown, dense, rough. Bread that needed more jaw strength than most gladiators. But bread wasn't the only ancient baked good. In Mesoamerica, corn was king. Not soft, sweet corn on the cob, hard, flinty kernels that could shatter your molars. Until someone invented nixtamalization, which is a fancy word for soaking corn in alkaline water until it becomes soft, mashable, and actually nutritious. The result? Masa. Masa becomes tortillas, tamales, corn cakes cooked on hot stones, layered with beans, chilies, and whatever wasn't rotting that day. It's genius. It's survival. It's delicious. And it's made with no stove, no fridge, no rolling pin. Just hands, fire, and 1,000 years of wisdom passed down through calloused fingers. Let's not forget the sweet stuff. Yes, ancient people had dessert. It wasn't chocolate lava cake, it wasn't creme brulee, but it was real and it mattered. In ancient India, honey was everything, used in rituals, medicine, and food. They made sweet cakes from rice flour, sesame, ghee, and honey, fried on stone griddles, sticky, dense, divine, and probably capable of summoning at least 3 ants per second. In the Americas, they boiled agave sap into syrup, drizzled it on cactus fruit, or poured it over seeds mashed into patties and left to dry in the sun. Sweetness was rare, but when it appeared, it was celebrated. Because food wasn't just fuel, it was joy. Even back then, even when the fire was weak and the flour was mostly sand. Even when you had to fight a bear to get the last honeycomb. Now picture this. It's night. The stars are out. You've spent the whole day hunting, foraging, grinding, baking. Your hands are blistered, your feet are raw, and the bread you just made is still warm. You tear it in half. Steam rises into the cold night air. You share it with the person next to you. They smile. You both chew in silence. And for just a moment, you forget how hard it all is. You forget the danger, the hunger, the injuries. Because the bread is soft. The fire is warm. And you are, miraculously, still here. That was the magic. That was ancient cooking. Not easy, not clean, but real. Every bite was earned. Every meal was a battle won. No electric whisk. No non-stick pan. No DoorDash. Just hands, fire, stone, and survival. So the next time your sourdough starter dies or your oven burns your banana bread, remember this. Your ancestors made cake with no sugar, made bread with no yeast, made food with no tools. And they passed it all down to you through scars, smoke, and stories.
So, we've reached the end, or at least the end of the meal. You've hunted, you've foraged, you've roasted, baked, buried, burned, and, let's be honest, probably poisoned yourself a few times. You've made bread out of bark, soup out of bone, cake out of guesswork, and somehow, you're still alive. But now it's time to answer the real question. How? How did ancient people cook, really cook, without the tools we consider essential? No knife set, no cutting board, no preheated anything.
No timers, no instructions, just instinct, fire, and the kind of stubbornness that only comes from knowing that the next meal might be your last. Let's break it down. Tool number 1, fire. Not a stove, not a campfire, but fire. Period. And not the button on the stove kind. The kind you had to earn. You made it with friction, or flint, or by braying hard enough that lightning would strike the right tree. Then you kept it alive, fed it, sheltered it, because if it went out, so did your chances of eating, staying warm, or not dying in the dark. Fire wasn't a convenience. It was a god. And you learned to control it. Not perfectly, not safely, but enough to turn raw into cooked. Enough to invent cuisine. Tool number 2, stone. Your knife, your hammer, your blender, your griddle. You cracked bones with stone to get marrow. You mashed herbs. You ground grain. You carved meat. And if the stone broke, you found another. Because the rock didn't care about your feelings, only your technique. Tool number 3, time. Because cooking back then wasn't fast. It wasn't scheduled. It was slow, painfully slow. You waited for meat to smoke, for roots to soften, for dough to rise, maybe. There were no shortcuts, just patience, and a vague hope that whatever you were making wouldn't kill you when you tasted it. Tool number 4, the senses. No thermometer. So you listened to the crackle of fire, the sizzle of fat, the hiss of something bubbling over. No oven light. So you watched for color, steam, smoke. No recipe app. So you tasted, adjusted, added ash for crunch, bark for bitterness, hope for balance. And when all else failed, you smelled it. If it stank, you threw it to the dogs. If they wouldn't eat it either, you buried it and never spoke of it again. Tool number 5, memory. Because nothing was written down. Your recipes were stories. Your instructions were songs. Your measurements were handfuls, pinches, glances, and the occasional shrug. You learned by watching, repeating, failing, trying again. Every burn scar told a lesson. Every bitter root remembered. And so food became ancestral knowledge, passed from hands to hands, mouth to mouth, fire to fire. But here's the thing. Despite the danger, despite the lack of tools, despite the sheer absurdity of trying to cook on rocks while fending off wolves and starvation, ancient cooking worked. Not because it was perfect, but because it was adaptable. Different regions, different climates, different materials. Yet every culture, every single one, figured it out. In the Arctic, blubber stew cooked in seal fat lamps. In the rainforest, banana leaves folded into steam pouches of wild root and frog. On the savanna, antelope roasted over acacia wood. In the mountains, barley boiled at high altitudes because nothing else grew. They cooked with clay, with bone, with shells and sand and sticks. They baked bread in the desert using nothing but heat trapped in the sand. They boiled soup in baskets by dropping in fire-heated stones. They used ants to sew wounds. They probably used ants as seasoning too, because necessity is the sharpest blade, and hunger is the best teacher. They made tools from nothing, turned disasters into traditions, turned rot into preservation, and turned food into culture. Not just survival, but identity. Because to eat like an ancient human was to know the land, the cycle of seasons, the sting of hunger, and the miracle of just enough. Now pause. Look at your kitchen, your drawers, your gadgets, your air fryer, your blender, your spice rack. You live in a time where salt comes in 10 varieties, and you still complain that the fries are bland. Your fridge has more food in it than some villages had an entire year. And still you order takeout because there's nothing to eat. You scroll past 10,000 recipes and still say, I don't know what to make. But your ancestors? They had 3 ingredients, a stick, and a fire they kept alive with sheer willpower. And they made it work. They didn't have cookbooks. They had consequences. You burn the stew, you go hungry. You eat the wrong mushroom, you hallucinate God, then die. You leave the fire unattended, you wake up freezing and alone. And somehow, out of all that, they cooked. They thrived. So the next time you turn on your oven and it preheats in under 5 minutes, take a second. Feel grateful, because you didn't have to chase a boar with a rock just to make dinner. Because your stove didn't require prayer and kindling. Because your food isn't wrapped in moss and guesswork. Because you, dear listener, are the product of thousands of generations who figured it out with nothing and still managed to feed the future.